The HOA said I couldn't touch the water. So I bought the whole shoreline. They thought I was just another quiet neighbor. Someone who follows the rules. Someone who never causes trouble. But when the letter came, when the fine landed on my doorstep, everything changed. They didn't know I had a plan. They didn't know I had read the law. And they definitely didn't know who really owned the lake. By the end of this story, you'll see the HOA never expected what was coming. Welcome to HOA Secrets Uncovered. I'm your host, just a regular guy named Jake. I live in a small suburban town where lawns are perfect and rules are everywhere. I work a normal 9-to-5 job. But when I come home, I see the crazy things HOAs do. And I share the secrets, the petty battles, and the justice stories nobody talks about. Today, you're going to hear the story of the lake. A story about rules, power, and a man who refused to be controlled. A story where patience and the law became the ultimate revenge. I moved into this neighborhood thinking it was peaceful. Quiet streets, well-kept lawns, friendly faces. I thought I could finally have a little peace after long days at work. I thought I could enjoy the small things, like fishing in the lake behind my house, or sitting on the dock with a cup of coffee in the early morning. The first few days were perfect. I waved to neighbors. I smiled at the mailman. Everything seemed normal. Too normal, I should have known. Then the first note appeared. A small envelope taped to my front door. It had the HOA logo on it. And I knew right away this wasn't going to be friendly. Inside, a crisp letter. You are not allowed to touch the water. Violation will incur fines. I laughed at first. I thought it was a joke. The HOA always seemed silly rules about lawn colors, mailbox heights, even rules about what flowers we could plant. But the water, that seemed absurd. The next day, I went to the lake, just to test it. I dipped my hand in nothing. No one came running. No one shouted. Maybe it was a mistake. But I didn't see her at first. The HOA president, standing at the end of the dock. Her arms crossed, sunglasses hiding her eyes. And her smile, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You can't touch the water, she said. Simple words but heavy. Like a warning. Like a test. I tried to joke. I was just testing the temperature. But she didn't smile. Her eyes stayed cold. And in that moment, I realized this was serious. The next few days, things escalated. Small fines, letters, emails. All demanding I stop. All threatening consequences if I violated community property rules again. I started watching her. Watching them. The board members. Every little move. It was like living under a microscope. Every fishing pole, every cup of coffee on the dock. Every moment outside, monitored. It felt absurd. And funny in a dark way. How much power could a few people really have? How far could they go? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized. I wasn't afraid. I was curious. Curious about the laws. Curious about the lake. Curious about the limits of their control. One evening, I sat on my porch, watching the sun set behind the water. And I wondered, what if they had no real authority? What if the rules were meaningless? The curiosity grew. So I started reading. Old county records, federal regulations, property maps. And that's when I found it. Something they didn't know. Something no HOA board member had ever checked. The lake wasn't private. Not really. It was part of a federal waterway. which meant, technically, it was public property. Their rules were mostly empty threats. I felt a rush, a mix of excitement and fear. I had discovered something dangerous if used wrong, but also something powerful. The next day, I went back to the lake, fishing pole in hand, coffee on the dock. And she was there again. The president, arms crossed, frown in place, waiting for me to make a move. "You know you can't be here," she said, her voice sharp like a whip. I looked at her calmly and smiled. "I know," I said, but inside I was thinking, how far could this go? How much could one HOA board try to control a man and the water behind his house? Days went by. More letters, more threats. But I stayed. Every morning, coffee in hand, fishing pole ready, waiting for the next move. And I knew, eventually, there would be a move that changed everything. Neighbors started noticing. Some whispered. Some stared. I could feel the tension building, like the calm before a storm. And I was ready for it. It was funny, really, how these small petty rules could make grown adults act like tyrants, and how in their arrogance they didn't see that I had something they did. Knowledge, patience, and a plan. I walked along the dock one evening, watching the water ripple, thinking about the letters, the fines, the threats. And I realized this wasn't just about fishing, or coffee, or the lake. It was about control, power, and who really owned the space they tried to claim. I took a deep breath, looking at the water, feeling the sun on my face. And I asked myself, how far would they go before I made my move? And that, my friends, is where our story truly begins. But before I take you deeper, I have to ask you, if you discovered your HOA was trying to control something that legally belongs to you, would you quietly obey? Or would you start planning your own way to fight back? I thought the first letter was enough. A small warning, maybe a misunderstanding. But it was. The fines started coming. Small amounts, nothing that would ruin me. But the tone, the words, they felt personal. Like the HOA was speaking directly at me. Watching every move, I walked through the neighborhood, noticing the little things, the perfectly mowed lawns, the paint on every house matching exactly, even the way the trash bins were lined up at the curb. Everything controlled, everything judged. I went back to my mailbox one afternoon. Another envelope, this time thicker. Inside, a full printout of the community rules. Every rule, every regulation, every demand. And then my favorite line. You are prohibited from touching the water behind your house. I laughed quietly to myself. And then I realized they were serious. And this wasn't just about water. It was about control, about proving power over someone. And they had picked me. The HOA president. I started noticing. She had a way of looking, like she was always 2 steps ahead, like she knew exactly what I would do. And she enjoyed it, watching me squirm, worrying, questioning myself. I began to notice the other board members. They whispered in meetings, nodded at each other, glanced at me. Sometimes I swear they were taking notes. Every little thing I did, every move I made. It was like I was living in a cage, invisible bars, made of paper and threats. And yet, I didn't feel defeated. Not yet. I felt challenged. I felt alive. I started following the rules, exactly. Every letter, every guideline. mowing my lawn to the exact height, painting the trim just the right color, even planting the exact flowers allowed. I wanted them to see I could be the perfect neighbor, the perfect resident, the perfect victim. But inside I was plotting. I was learning the system, watching the rules, finding their weaknesses, their loopholes. I noticed small contradictions, rules that couldn't exist together, conflicting demands that made their enforcement impossible. And I smiled quietly, thinking about the future. Then came the inspection, the dreaded weekly check, the HOA president walking the streets, clipboard in hand. She stopped at my house. I watched from the porch calm, coffee in hand. She stared, measured, frowned, and left a note. You are fully compliant for now. For now. Those words lingered in my mind. Like a challenge, like an invitation, like a dare. I started talking to neighbors, cautiously. Some agreed quietly. The HOA was too controlling. Some stayed silent, afraid of retaliation. But everyone had a story. About petty fines, meaningless letters, small threats that felt huge. And I realized I wasn't alone. This wasn't just about me. This was about everyone trapped in their rules. One evening, I decided to test the boundaries. I walked down to the dock slowly, casually, just enough to feel the water on my boots. I looked around. No one came running. No one shouted. And yet I knew she was watching. I could feel her eyes, burning from the end of the dock. But I didn't flinch. I didn't move quickly. I just stood there, smiling, watching her watch me. And then it happened. A letter slid under my door. Thick, official-looking, threatening. Violation of community rules. $250 fine. Repeated offenses may lead to legal action. I opened it, read it slowly. Felt the weight of their authority trying to crush me. And I smiled again. Because I had read the law. I knew my rights. I knew that their threats were mostly empty. Still, the tension built. Every day, every hour, every glance. It was a silent war. And I loved it. The quiet thrill of defiance. The feeling of holding power, quietly, patiently. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every note, every interaction. Photos, recordings, even timestamps. I wanted a record. Because someday, this would matter. And someday, they would see who really had control. I even started to play their game. I followed every rule, smiled at inspections, waved to the president. I nodded politely, listened carefully. I played the perfect compliant neighbor, the perfect quiet man. And they didn't suspect a thing. But inside, I was planning, calculating, waiting for the moment when their rules, their power, their obsession would backfire on them. One morning, I overheard a conversation. The HOA president talking to another board member. She's going to obey eventually. We just need to wait. I laughed softly. They didn't know. I had no intention of obeying blindly. I had other plans. Bigger plans. And then I realized it wasn't just about the water. It wasn't just about fishing. It wasn't even about me. It was about showing everyone that petty power can be challenged, can be beaten, can be laughed at if you know the rules and the law. That night I sat by the water, watching the moonlight shimmer on the surface, thinking about the letters, the threats, the inspections, thinking about the perfect little world they tried to build. And I wondered, quietly smiling to myself, how far would they go? to prove they could control something that didn't belong to them. And here's my question to you. If someone tried to control a small part of your life, something that should belong to you, would you quietly obey? Or would you quietly plan a way to turn the rules against them? I want to know, what would you do if the HOA tried to control your lake, your backyard, or your home? The day of the HOA meeting came faster than I expected. I didn't know what to feel. Excited, nervous, curious. Probably all three at once. I walked into the community center. The air smelled like polished floors and old coffee. Chairs lined up in perfect rows. The board members already seated. Clipboards, pens, eyes sharp as knives. And there she was, the president, sitting at the head of the table. Her smile polite but cold. Her eyes sharp, judging, calculating. I found a seat near the back, trying not to appear too confident, but also not too afraid. Just a normal neighbor, listening, observing, waiting. The meeting started. Agenda items, lawn colors, mailbox heights, tree trimming schedules. I tuned out most of it, because my focus was on her. The one person who had made this personal. Who had sent the letters, the fines. Who had made the lake, the water, a battlefield. And then my name was called. I felt every head in the room turn toward me. Whispers floated in the air. I stood slowly, feeling every eye on me. And I realized, this was the moment. The moment I could make them uncomfortable. The moment I could test them. The moment I could see how far they would go. The president looked at me. Her smile polite but her eyes empty. You have been violating our community rules regarding the water behind your property, she said. Her tone calm, controlled. But I could hear the edge in it. The thinly veiled threat. I took a deep breath. And I smiled slowly. Yes, I have been near the water, I said. I have been fishing, enjoying the lake behind my property. Because it is part of my property, and I have confirmed that it is also part of a federal waterway. There was silence. A silence so loud I could hear the creak of chairs, the scribbling of pens, the muffled whispers of neighbors. The president blinked. Her calm faltered for just a second. Then she recovered. We have the authority to enforce these rules, she said. But the law says otherwise, I replied. And then I laid out my evidence. County property maps, waterway laws, federal regulations. All printed, highlighted, undeniable. Some neighbors gasped quietly. Some shook their heads. Even a few board members looked surprised. And I could see it in her eyes. Fear, confusion, frustration. She hadn't expected this. No one had expected me to be ready. She tried to interrupt, to assert control, to make me back down. But every time she spoke, I had an answer. Calm, polite, factual. And the room grew tense, like a storm waiting to break. Then came the part I didn't anticipate. Some of the neighbors, emboldened, whispered agreements. Quietly at first, then louder. I thought we couldn't touch the water either, one said. Now I see it's legal, another added. And suddenly the room shifted. It was no longer just me. It was a small army of quiet compliance ready to rise. The president's calm cracked just a little. Her smile faltered, her eyes darted. She realized the control she thought she had slipping. And in that moment, I felt a surge of confidence. Not arrogance, just clarity. I wasn't fighting a board. I was awakening the neighborhood. Minutes passed, hours, I don't know exactly. The meeting finally adjourned. But the energy, the tension lingered. Like electricity in the air. You could feel it. every whispered conversation outside the hall, every glance she gave me as I walked past, every step she took back to her car. She was thinking, planning, frustrated, scared. I walked home slowly, thinking about what had just happened. The fear in her eyes, the quiet support of neighbors. And I realized this wasn't just about water. It was about power, about control, about who gets to decide what is right in this quiet suburban world. That night, I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the moon reflect on the lake, thinking about her, about the board, about the neighborhood. And I smiled quietly, because I knew this was only the beginning. And the next move had to be perfect. I kept thinking about how petty rules, how small fines, how small threats could affect people's lives, and how, with knowledge, patience, and courage, they could be turned against the ones trying to control you. And as I stared into the dark water, I wondered if someone like me, armed only with the law and determination, could really beat an entire HOA, could really turn their rules, their authority against them. And here's what I want to know from you. If you were in a meeting, facing a board that tried to control your life, would you speak up? Would you fight? Or would you stay quiet and obey? After the meeting, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept turning, replaying every word, every glance, every subtle smirk. The president thought she had control, but I had something she did. Knowledge. I spent the next morning at my small desk, surrounded by stacks of papers, county maps, federal documents, old case studies about waterways and property rights. I started reading, line by line, slowly, carefully. And that's when I found it. Something amazing, something they never checked. The lake, the water behind my house. It wasn't private, not in the way they claimed. It was connected to a federal waterway. Technically, part of the public domain, which meant the HOA had no authority over it at all. I leaned back in my chair, heart racing, a mix of excitement and disbelief. All this time, they had been threatening me, fining me, acting like tyrants, and their power was empty. I started taking notes, highlighting every clause, every sentence, every regulation that backed me up. I wanted proof, something undeniable, something they couldn't argue with. And then an idea began forming. A plan, quiet, calculated. I would follow the rules, comply outwardly, but I would also use the law, the federal law, to show them that their power had limits. I went back to the lake that afternoon, walking slowly, deliberately, feeling the sun on my face, the wind on the water, and I realized the first time I had ever truly felt free. But I also knew I had to be careful. The HOA was sneaky, petty, obsessed. They would notice anything unusual, anything small that might hint I was planning something. So I kept my smile, my calm, my polite neighbor act. And I waited. Days passed. Letters continued. Warnings, threats, violations. But I ignored them mostly. I had something bigger, something that couldn't be challenged legally. And I knew soon they would find out. One morning, I saw her again. The HOA president, packing near the dock. I waved casually. She didn't wave back. Her eyes flicked toward the water, then back at me. And I swear, I saw a hint of worry, a flicker of fear. She didn't know, and I didn't move quickly. I let her imagination do the work. That night, I shared my findings with a few neighbors, quietly. A couple of brave ones. They gasped. They laughed quietly, and I could see it in their eyes. The same feeling I had felt. The taste of freedom. The realization. The HOA wasn't invincible. I kept thinking about the letters, the fines, the rules. All those small acts of control. All that pettiness. And now, knowing the law, it all felt ridiculous. Like a child trying to hold the ocean in a cup. I began imagining what would happen if I used this knowledge carefully. If I acted slowly, methodically. Could I turn their rules against them? Could I show the neighborhood the truth without breaking a single law? Just by understanding it better than anyone else. The next week, the president tried something new. She called me formally, inviting me to discuss compliance at her office. I smiled politely and agreed. I had to play along, act normal, pretend I was intimidated. Pretend. The office was small, cold, clinical. Certificates on the wall, fake smiles in frames. She offered coffee. I declined. And then she started talking. Jake, we just want to keep the neighborhood safe. The water, the rules, it's for everyone's benefit. I nodded politely. Inside, I was calculating every word, every pause, every threat hidden in her sentences. I said nothing at first. Let her think she had one. Then I spoke calmly, slowly. I understand, and I want to comply. But I also researched the property laws. And I found that the lake, my property, connected to a federal waterway. It's legally public, not under HOA control. Her smile faltered just a little. Her eyes darted around. I could see the panic begin to rise. She tried to speak, but I interrupted gently. Of course, I respect the neighborhood and the rules. But I will also follow the law. And I suggest you do the same. Silence. A long, tense silence. And then she said nothing. Just stared at me. The first real crack in her armor. The first time I saw fear, subtle, creeping. And I knew. Everything was about to change. I left her office, slowly. Calmly. Walking down the quiet streets. Feeling the air on my face. The knowledge in my mind. Like a secret weapon. Something no one could take away. That night, I sat by the lake again. Thinking about what I had learned. Thinking about the power, the knowledge, the patience. I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for the neighborhood. For anyone trapped by petty rules. By fear, by control. And then it hit me. The moment of real suspense. If I moved too soon. If I acted too openly. They could retaliate. They could try legal action. They could make life difficult. But if I waited, if I acted carefully, I could turn everything, their power, their rules, their obsession, against them. I looked at the water, moonlight shimmering on the surface, and I asked myself quietly, what is the perfect moment to strike? When do you turn knowledge into action? Without breaking the law, without losing your advantage. And now I ask you, if you discovered a secret that could take away someone's power, would you wait patiently? Or would you act immediately and risk everything? The morning felt different, heavy, tense, like the air itself was holding its breath. I noticed the HOA president packing near the dock, her clipboard in hand, muttering quietly to herself. I knew immediately. Something was about to happen. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, fishing pole tucked under my arm. trying to look calm, ordinary, like any other neighbor. But inside, I was alert, watching, waiting. She spotted me immediately. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed tight. I waved casually. She didn't wave back. Instead, she strode toward the water, with two other board members behind her. And then I saw it. The sign. A big metal sign with bold letters. No trespassing, HOA property. My heart skipped a beat, but only for a moment. I stared at the sign, then at her. And I smiled quietly, because I knew the truth. The lake wasn't theirs, and the sign meant nothing legally. She walked closer, pointing at the sign. "This is your last warning," she said. "The water is not for your use. You are trespassing." I took a slow sip of coffee, nodded politely. "Yes, I understand," I said. But inside, I was calculating my next move. I decided to test them. Just a little. I stepped toward the water, carefully, slowly, watching her reaction. Her eyes widened. Her jaw tightened. And I knew I had them right where I wanted them. "You can't do that," she said sharply. I looked at her calmly. "I'm following the law. The federal waterway regulations, which say the lake is public, not HOA property." Her face flushed. And then she tried something new. She stepped forward, as if to block me. I held my ground. Calmly, silently, confidently. She waved her arms, muttered about fines and legal action. I nodded politely, still smiling. I didn't move fast. I let her frustration grow, like a storm building quietly in the distance. The neighbors were watching now, some from their porches, some from across the street. I could feel their eyes. Curious, surprised, maybe a little excited. I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had been trapped by petty rules. Everyone who had stayed quiet, fearing the HOA's power. Then she made a mistake. She called the police, said I was trespassing on HOA property. I could hear her muttering. "How can they not see she owns it? How can this be legal?" And I smiled again, because I had my evidence. Everything documented, printed, highlighted. I knew exactly what would happen. A squad car arrived, slow, cautious. Officers stepped out, professional, polite. I walked toward them, slowly, calmly, handing them copies of the law, showing them maps, showing them the federal regulations, explaining clearly, patiently. The officers listened, asked questions, nodded, and then quietly, they told the HOA president, "You don't have authority here. This is federal waterway property." Her face went pale. Her hands trembled slightly. And I knew she realized the tables had turned. I could feel the tension in the air, thick, electric. The board members were speechless. The neighbors curious, astonished. And I calm, satisfied, because I had followed the law. And they had crossed the line between authority and obsession. After the police left, I stood on the dock, watching the water ripple in the morning sun. The sign still there, meaningless. The HOA president walking away, furious, defeated silently. And I realized, this moment, this victory, was more than just about the lake. It was about standing up, about patience, about knowing the law and using it. I walked home slowly, thinking about what had just happened, thinking about the power of knowledge, thinking about the small joys, fishing, coffee, peace, freedom. And then I wondered if I had acted too quickly, if I had shown my knowledge too soon? Would they have tried to trap me in legal battles? Would they have escalated? Would I have lost the advantage I had built so carefully? The adrenaline slowly faded, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. And yet, I knew this wasn't the end. The HOA, the president, they wouldn't give up so easily. They would regroup, plan, wait for another moment to assert control. But now, the neighborhood had seen the truth, and I had the law on my side. The next moves would be theirs, but I would be ready, always ready. As I sat on my porch that night, watching the moonlight reflect on the lake, I thought about the little victories and the petty tyrants who thought they were untouchable. And I asked myself quietly, what other rules, other boundaries could be challenged? If you knew the law, the truth, and your own patience. And here's the question I want to ask you. If someone tried to control something that legally belonged to you, would you act immediately? Or would you wait patiently, planning, observing, until the perfect moment? The air was thick that morning. A quiet tension hung over the neighborhood. I knew today would be different. Something was about to change. Something big. I woke early, sunlight spilling over the rooftops, coffee in hand, fishing pole leaning against the porch. But today, it wasn't about fishing. It wasn't about coffee. It was about taking control. I drove to the county property auction. Documents in my bag, notes, maps, legal references. I watched silently as parcels of land went up for bid. Some neighbors whispered to each other, curious, concerned. And then I saw it. The shoreline, the very water the HOA tried to control. It was listed publicly, legally. And it was mine to claim. I raised my hand quietly, bidding deliberately, watching the board members in the audience. I could see their expressions. Confusion, shock, disbelief. They didn't understand what I was doing. They never checked this auction, never considered, never thought a normal neighbor could fight back. The bid went up, slowly, deliberately. Each number calculated, precise. And when the hammer fell, the shoreline was mine. All of it legally, officially. I smiled quietly. Victory felt calm, satisfying. Not loud, not bragging, just certain. I returned home, carrying the paperwork. The proof of ownership, legal documents, undeniable. The HOA would see soon enough. And when they did, they wouldn't have a single argument left. I walked down to the lake. The sign still stood, no trespassing, HOA property. I chuckled quietly. It didn't matter anymore. The law was on my side. The lake, the dock, every ripple in the water. All mine. I put up a new sign. Simple, clear, official. Private access, federal waterway property. Bold letters, impossible to ignore. I stepped back, coffee in hand, observing. And I waited. Within hours they came. The HOA president, furious, packing back and forth. Board members trailing behind her, muttering, whispering. I walked calmly to the dock, smiled politely. "Good morning," I said. They didn't respond. Their mouths moved, but no words. I could see the panic in their eyes. They realized finally. They had lost control. They tried to argue. "This is still HOA property," she shouted. I handed her the paperwork, calmly, quietly. Maps, auctions, federal regulations. Every point, every fact undeniable. Her face turned red, then pale, then angry again. But there was nothing she could do. Nothing at all. Neighbors began to gather. Some from porches, some from cars. They watched silently, quietly. Some nodded at me approvingly, secretly. Some whispered, shocked at what had just happened. The HOA president turned beet red, muttering about legal loopholes. I smiled politely, sipped my coffee. Because now the balance of power had shifted. For days they tried to challenge me. Letters, phone calls, emails. Threats, warnings, we will sue. I followed the law carefully. Responded calmly. And each attempt fizzled. Because I had done everything right, legally, meticulously, perfectly. I walked along the shoreline one evening, watching the sun sink behind the trees, feeling the breeze on my face, thinking about the tension, the fines, the threats. And I realized this wasn't just a victory for me. It was a message to anyone who tried to control, to dominate, to intimidate. Patience, knowledge, law, and calm can overcome even the most obsessive tyrants. But I also knew they wouldn't forget. They would watch, waiting for the smallest mistake, for the tiniest slip. And I had to be careful, always patient, always ready. The lake was calm now, peaceful, my own. The dock, the water, the sunlight reflecting on the ripples, all belonged to me. And yet the adrenaline, the thrill, stayed alive, quietly in the back of my mind. Because this wasn't just about water. It was about respect, power, justice. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about everything that had led here. The letters, the meetings, the threats, the tense silence of neighbors watching, and the calm satisfaction of following the law perfectly. I knew this victory was more than mine. It was proof that even the smallest neighbor, the quietest man, can stand up to power and win. And then I asked myself, quietly, smiling at the water, if you suddenly had complete control over something everyone else wanted, would you hold it quietly? Would you flaunt it? Or would you use it to teach a lesson, carefully, patiently? The morning was quiet, almost eerily so. No whispers from neighbors, no murmurs of the board. Just the gentle sound of water lapping against the dock. Sunlight reflecting off every ripple, shimmering like gold. I stood at the edge of the shoreline, coffee in hand, looking at what I had won, what I had claimed. Not just the lake, not just the land, but respect, freedom, control without arrogance, without violence. Just patience, law, and careful planning. The HOA president, she came later reluctantly. Alone this time. No board members in tow. She stopped at the edge of my property, clipped a small folder to the railing, and said nothing. Not a word. Just turned and walked away. I opened the folder slowly. Inside, formal letters, acknowledging that the lake was my property, that the federal waterway laws gave me full access, that the HOA had no authority here. No fines, no restrictions, no threats. Every piece of paper stamped, signed, undeniable. I smiled quietly, sipped my coffee, feeling the morning sun on my face. And I realized this wasn't just about a lake. It was about life, about the power of patience, the power of knowledge, the quiet strength of standing your ground. Neighbors began to appear slowly, cautiously. Some waved, some whispered congratulations. Some just watched, eyes wide. I waved back, smiled politely, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and calm. For the first time, I truly felt at peace. I walked along the shoreline, listening to the gentle sound of the water, thinking about the weeks that had led here. The letters, the meetings, the fines, the threats, the tension, the quiet observation, the planning. Everything had mattered. Every small act, every quiet move had built up to this moment. And then I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. I had set an example for anyone who had ever felt powerless, for anyone who had lived under petty rules or obsessive control. Sometimes the smallest, quietest person can change the balance of power simply by understanding it and using it wisely. I sat on the dock that afternoon, fishing pole in hand, coffee beside me, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. Neighbors waved from their porches. Some smiled, some shook their heads, some whispered to each other quietly, talking about the lake victory, about the quiet man who beat the HOA at their own game. And I thought about her, the president, the woman who had tried to control everything, who had underestimated patience, knowledge, and law. I wondered if she had learned anything, if she would try this again, or if she would finally respect the limits of power. The wind moved across the water, gentle, steady. And I realized this was more than a win. It was a lesson, not just to them, but to me, to everyone who had watched, everyone who had doubted. Sometimes the calm after the storm is the most powerful moment of all. I took a deep breath, let it out slowly, feeling the quiet victory settle over me, feeling the satisfaction of patience rewarded. And I smiled quietly, because I knew no amount of petty power, no amount of obsession could ever take this away. And yet, a question lingered in my mind, a thought I couldn't shake. Even in victory, even in calm, what comes next? When the tyrants retreat, quietly planning, watching, will the calm last? Or will there always be someone waiting to challenge your freedom, your patience, your law? And now I ask you, if you had won a battle against someone who tried to control you, would you rest quietly satisfied? Or would you prepare, watch, and guard for the next challenge waiting around the corner? Type your answer in the comments, because sometimes the real story isn't just about winning. It's about what you do after the victory.